Ata Marie, good morning everybody. Welcome to day 2. My name's Mark Lester. I'm Acting Chief Architect at Housing New Zealand at the moment. Let's start with a bit of housekeeping, just especially for those of you who might not have been here at day 1. Well, first of all, thanks to the sponsors. Really great job. Datacom Premier sponsor, Rivera, Webb Henderson, Intergen, Silver Stripes program sponsors, Eagle Technology, thanks for the coffee. IBM for the juice, Dimension Data for these compendiums. More on this later. Intech Solutions for the pads and pens, Critchlow for the ice cream. I did have one, that's great. AMS for the lunch today, and NZ Rise for yesterday's lunch. So coffee, juice, ice cream, help yourself from through here. Catering also will be next door for you all as well. Power on your desks for laptops, should be there in front of you. And Wi-Fi through the Te Papa free network. Fire evacuation, there'll be hosts, and there's an exit here. Earthquake, we don't seem to have a limited supply of tables, so it might be a bit sort of lifeboats on the Titanic situation as you all dive under them, but there you go. Let's hope it doesn't happen. 8.5 I hear, we're good for, so we may be okay. Toilets are down the hall to the left and then doors on the left. And cell phones, of course. And car parking, discounted car parking is available. Take your parking ticket to the registration desk to get it validated so you can cash in on discounted parking, and smoking outside the confines of the building, please. So once again, thanks to Webb Henderson for sponsoring this morning's session. Now, hands up, who follows the conference on Twitter? Awesome, that's great. Well, because the thing is, you can pick up all sorts of stuff on Twitter, can't you? Someone obviously liked the Eagle coffee, because I was having a look last night and I saw a photo of a cup of coffee. It's great. Eagle sponsor, very clear. I also found out that Christchurch Beck, hands up, where's Christchurch Beck? Oh, there we are, same person, fantastic. I found out that Christchurch Beck is a real fan of these compendiums, so great. I'm really pleased we've hit the mark there. It was also good to hear Liz Scott Wilson describing Mandy and David last night, talking about RealMe, described them as interesting and engaging. That's a bonus, excellent. But on the other hand, Liz also tweeted, not as good as FutureGov, so there. Which is kind of harsh, but I guess that's the reality of that sort of instant public feedback sort of thing. So well done to the committee for making that channel available for that feedback to come back to you. But I think actually it's got to be good for us all as paying customers that there's a bit of fierce rivalry between the different conferences in Wellington and our choices for where we go. So hands up, how many of you go to Webstock? Yeah, okay. Cool. Because the thing is, on the way in on the train yesterday, I'm pretty sure it was some of that sort of fierce, jealous rivalry that from Mike Brown, who's the organizer of Webstock. Mike, are you here? No. Anyway, what he said was, it's much more fun to read day 2 of the Govis program if you substitute clown for cloud. Anyway, that's what Twitter thought. So whatever you think, how about a round of applause for Roz, Matt, and the Committee of Volunteers for organising the Govis Conference. Who's seen the 100 years of public sector, public service timeline out in the foyer? It's well worth a look. It's great, actually. It's sort of nestled against the ageing equipment. I don't know quite what that means. Anyway, so I guess if you have a look through that, 100 years of an apolitical professional public service, it strikes me, I'm really interested in the idea of trust, and it strikes me that trust is really important to us. One of the things that I'm sure we can be proud of is the fact that New Zealand is first equal in the least corrupt nation in the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. First equal, least untrustworthy. It's a great accolade. Also, so that's 100 years, but also we've got one thing I'm not sure if we mentioned yesterday, is that we're also 20 years of the Privacy Act this year as well. We heard about some recent changes to the Act last thing yesterday, and my own reflections on yesterday were that it was the discussions around privacy, Jennifer, for example, who really seemed to draw out the strongest feelings. I thought that was really interesting. And you might have seen the recent joke travelling around about the new Facebook privacy options. Share with everyone, share with friends and the CIA, only for me and the CIA, and only for the CIA. And I think that sort of humour is a sort of peculiarly human response to that loss of trust that comes with something like that. I'm the sort of person who believes that while the dollar is the currency of the private sector, here in the public sector, our currency is trust. Like hands up, who knows where in the Kiwis count drivers of customer satisfaction value for money sits? Is it first, second, third, fourth? Anyone want to have a guess? It's actually way down. I can't even remember. It's like 7, 8, 9, something way down. Up the top are things like meets expectations. Okay, and I think that our customers have expectations around privacy. I think we need to invest in that trust wisely. And as the Office of the Privacy Commissioner says on its website in a great plain English publication called Cloud Computing, A Guide to Making the Right Choices. This is written for all agencies, not just for government agencies, or all parties. What it says is the bottom line is you're responsible for the information that you put in the cloud. Go and have a look on their website. It's a good publication. So yesterday was all about collaboration. Today is about cloud. Shortly, I'm going to introduce Dr. Steve Hodgkinson. He's going to talk about a framework that he's developed that can help us understand the catalysts for business readiness and executive enthusiasm for cloud adoption. It's the first piece of work I've seen that, I guess, captures or describes the conditions that are necessary for a tipping point to be achieved in an agency around cloud services adoption. I think it's very helpful. But before we hear from Steve, if you have a look at the Govis 2013 program for today, you'll see at 3 p.m. today we have a panel session. Now, the way I'm structuring this is a sort of a series of short flash debates about a number of questions around cloud. I'm quite interested to see what happens when we put Steve and 3 other cloud experts together on stage and kind of let them have at each other. Well, I get to play, I guess, ringmaster. Oh, wait, that says cloud, not clowns. To prepare for the debate, as you listen to Steve and the rest of today's speakers, I want you to think about some questions that I'm just going to read out in a moment, and how they relate to your own thoughts and experiences with cloud technologies. So, for example, where you are, who's driving cloud adoption? Is it driven by strategic intent or tactical responses? Is it driven top-down, or is it being driven bottom-up? Another question, what does it mean as we shift from products, bespoke, COTS, customized off the shelf, as we shift more and more towards services? What does that mean? Are you ready for the business change that goes with adopting a service in that way? Are you ready to benefit from the constant evolution of those services? Next question, are you losing control or gaining freedom? You lose control over how that service evolves, and you might be losing control, jurisdictional control over data perhaps, or as an opportunity to embrace the agility and the flexibility that goes with that, the freedom. Are you managing risks or rewards? Privacy, security fears, challenges of how you integrate those services into your existing enterprise, or are you taking advantage of the speed of deployment, low upfront costs, ease of self-service, ubiquitous access, all those sorts of things that Steve will talk about shortly. And another question to think about is, what is the future of cloud? I mean, the whole idea of cloud as a commodity is great, but what happens to commodities? Well, like if you look at energy as a similar example, they get traded and all sorts of interesting things start happening, don't they? Spot markets, monopolies, regulation, what's going to happen? So to help stimulate that debate later on today, I'm really interested to hear what your questions might be as well. So I would ask you, whatever comes to mind, if you could write it down and hand it into the registration desk before the end of afternoon tea this afternoon, I think that would be great. It would really help fuel those flash debates this afternoon. It would be much appreciated. Right, now I want to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. Dr. Steve Hodgkinson is the Research Director for Ovum's IT Research and Advisory business in the Asia-Pacific region. Most of Steve's research work is around the use of and management of IT in the private and public sectors, covering evolution of the CIO role, enterprise-wide IT strategy, shared services, cloud computing, e-government and smart cities. Before joining Ovum, Steve was the Director of the e-Government Strategy and Policy, Deputy CIO for Victorian State Government in Melbourne. Steve has a doctorate in Management Studies from the University of Oxford and first-class honours degree from University of Otago. I've heard Steve speak once before, actually, so I'm in a position to give you just a couple of words of warning. First, and this might not happen, but Steve is one of those well-educated, quietly spoken, originally from Invercargill, spent a lot of time in Dunedin, who occasionally shows his passion for his topic by swearing. So please forgive him if he lets slip the odd F-bomb or whatever. It's just how it is. Second, are there any enterprise architects in the room? Well, I think you guys will know what I'm talking about. After Steve visited housing, you can probably imagine the kind of conversation I ended up having with one very inspired senior manager who basically realised that this whole cloud thing wasn't actually that difficult after all. It was an interesting conversation. Over to Steve.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now I'm going to watch my language now. It's the kind of thing that happens unconsciously, but now I'll be very careful. Okay, well, look, thank you very much for the opportunity to come to talk to you. I really appreciate, actually, the opportunity to come back and talk in New Zealand, as I kind of wander the world quite a lot, and really appreciate the opportunity to come back and talk to people in the country where I grew up. Now, first, just a few quizzes. Does anyone recognise this? Where is it? What is it? Invercargill. I was born in Invercargill. Does anyone recognise this? The James Cook Tavern, Dunedin, where I had my education. I spent a lot of time in the early part of my 20s on this place. Does anyone recognise where that is? Summit Ridge of Mount Cook. I was a mountaineer for the Mount Cook National Park. I worked in the Reserve Bank, my first serious job when I had to get a suit along the terrace as a systems analyst in the IT department. I was browsing the personnel manual in the Reserve Bank one day and discovered that they could send me to Oxford to do a PhD and pay for it. So I advise you all to go back and look in the HR manuals of your organisations. I spent a lot of time while I was in Oxford rowing. It was a passion that I had there. I worked for Anderson Consulting in London after I finished my PhD as a management consultant in the whole area of IT organisation, CIO roles, corporate IT, which was the topic of my PhD. Moved to Melbourne in 1994. This is a picture of what people in Melbourne do at the Melbourne Cup. So I learned about all of that. I had a .com adventure, so movinghome.com.au was a .com company I set up in the early years after the .com boom, as it were, which was a salutary experience in boardroom governance. The company was stolen from me in a boardroom takeover. As Mark said, I worked for the Victorian State Government in the role of Director e-Government Strategy and Policy, driving in practice what I developed as a theoretical set of propositions in my PhD work in Oxford, setting up a whole-of-government office of the CIO and trying to drive a program of reform in IT and government. I've been with Ovum since 2006. Ovum, for those of you that don't know, is an IT research and advisory firm, a UK version of Gartner, if that summarises things for you. And we focus in this region quite exclusively really on public sector and financial services. We have something like 70 or so government clients in the region at federal, state and local government in Australia, New Zealand and around Asia Pacific. Now, Michael Hennessy, Michael, I just ask you to stand up, is the government business manager for Ovum. He's here as well, so if you have any questions about Ovum, then please talk to Mike. So other interests these days, I have a Norton Commando, which I've had for a long time that I'm now too scared to ride. I spend most of my time in the weekend in Bunnings, doing that stuff. And far too much time, of course, on these things travelling around the world in my job. My family would say far, far too much time. Indeed, when I worked for Anderson's Consulting in London, my children were young then. I have 3 children. One of them was in the schoolroom challenge of drawing a picture of your dad at work, and my 3-year-old daughter drew a picture of me sitting on an aeroplane. So, what are my interests? The Encyclopedia of New Zealand has an entry on Samuel Hodgkinson, who is actually an ancestor. He was MP for Wallace County in Southland. And when I was doing my PhD, my dad found this, which I didn't know about until I was doing it. Samuel Hodgkinson was a great advocate for changing the system of government in New Zealand to a more federated model, balancing local councils and national government interests. And he wrote a paper called Some Suggestions on Reform of Local Government and Decentralisation of Parliament, which never got up. He was advocating the Canadian federal system of government. In my PhD work, this kind of notion was actually the core of what my PhD was all about. And it revolves around that damn pendulum that we all experience in our careers in IT. Why the heck is it that every 5 or 10 years ago we seem to go through this cyclical pendulum swing between centralising and decentralising IT? And inevitably the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater at each apogee of the pendulum. So you have very centralised IT, which becomes dysfunctional, rigid, one-size-fits-all, inefficient, unresponsive, mandated, etc. Pisses everyone off to the point where someone breaks and they go, no, we're going to change of leadership or whatever, we're going to kick this pendulum back the other way, decentralise it, devolve it, and then 5, 10 years later, everyone's annoyed about how chaotic and fragmented and underfunded and subscale and accidental everything is. So my PhD was all about the idea of strategic ICT management in a federal form of IT organisation, and what you could do to try and moderate the swings of that pendulum to make things a little more sensible and strategic rather than accidental and serendipitous. Now, since I've been working at Ovum, my focus has become cloud services, cloud computing. This is a Wordle picture of 30,000 words of my writings in the last year to give you a feel for the focus of what I talk about, what I write about, what I think about. So cloud services, government, cloud computing, agency perspectives on this. So the perspective of individual agencies, not just whole of government. Of course, it's in ICT. It's about policy, it's about business value, it's about procurement, etc. So that's by way of a preamble on kind of who I am and what I bring to the table, or try to. Now, so what is the big issue that we're really contemplating here? What I'd like to do is to talk for around about an hour or so, and then we've got an hour and a half. So I would like to have half an hour at the end for actual questions and discussion. So as we go through, if you can think of things that get your goat about what I'm saying, then do write them down and come back and quiz me on them later, please. But the big issue, as I see it, is that around the world, government desires are for new policy options, for service delivery innovation, and increased productivity. Productivity becoming a stronger and stronger desire as fiscal pressures mount. And when we look to IT these days, then we get this sense that it ought to be faster to do things. We look at the consumer world, cloud, social computing, mobile devices, etc. There is this idea that IT is becoming more lightweight, fleet of foot. But when executives or ministers turn to their formal mechanisms of IT in government, then that's not what they see. They tend to see more this notion of a ball around their foot. And there are lots of good reasons for that, of course. Procurement processes, risk management, information management, compliance, security, etc., etc. It's also the case that this ball and chain is expensive, like really expensive in terms of the scheme of things. I hesitated with the idea of maybe making this thing go into a gold colour a gold ball, but that would suggest that it had value and you could sell it. But of course, it's not like that. It's just expensive and not necessarily an asset for all of the categories of systems that we're talking about. So the notion of how to drive this more agile fleet of footness is something that I sometimes talk about as proliferative innovation. And when we look around, particularly at the consumer realm and in enterprises, then there is this idea of things are proliferating, and that proliferation is being associated with innovation. So we look at devices, and you would have seen many pictures like this over the years. Proliferation of devices, of course. It used to be that in times gone by, IT was in a small number of large lumps, and those lumps were under the control of professionals, executives and CIOs, IT professionals. Whereas now, of course, IT is in a large number of small lumps, and actually decisions about those lumps are increasingly being made by consumers in the consumer market or employees in an enterprise context. The iPad is the symbol of this whole thing. There's also a proliferation of solutions. So what we think of as software as a service or such like used to be, again, that applications came in large lumps and were under the control of the IT department. And it's now the case increasingly that applications come in smaller and smaller lumps, and decisions about their adoption are being made by people throughout the organisation rather than by only the IT department. And then there is proliferation of data, which is by far probably the worst and most kind of troublesome of these three proliferations. So it used to be the case that the data that we use to make decisions in organisations came from the small number of lumpy blobs of technology and applications, the transaction processing systems, the MIS, etc. And it's now the case that the data that we use to make decisions comes from all over the place, from, heaven forbid, from Wikipedia, from YouTube, from in the internet, and actually government is pushing that whole dynamic with its open data movement, so pushing data out, so that data that people will use to make decisions no longer comes exclusively from within their controlled IT environments. So these three proliferations are the kind of bane of IT strategy. And if you go back to kind of what's traditional IT strategy all about, then it's about trying to be anti-proliferative, basically. Less is more, anti-proliferation, consolidate, standardise, rationalise. Fewer moving parts, safer, less expensive, etc. Computer says no if you follow Little Britain is really the traditional logic. And a large part of what drives my thinking is that actually that logic is getting beyond us, actually. The game is kind of lost in much of that conversation because of the fact that proliferation is happening and accelerating, for one, and also it's associated with innovation. People in the workplace associate proliferation in their personal lives and in their work lives with innovation. So being anti-proliferation is in many parts starting to become perceived as being anti-innovation. So we need to think about this differently. So, in a sense, there's a kind of genie getting out of the bottle here, as far as the consolidate, rationalise, standardise game of IT strategy goes. And I'd like to flick through some perspectives on that, what I think of as 10 new IT realities for having in your mind when you think about the challenges and issues of managing IT in government now. So the first one, new reality number one, the status quo in government ICT has become unsustainable. And I see this all round the jurisdictions in all different countries now. I use this picture, which is offensive to anyone that regards themselves as in control of their IT operation, to characterise my observation anecdotally of the maturity and sophistication of ICT capabilities across the average government department over the last decade or 15 years or so, and from a business executive perspective. And the way I think of it is, the best you can say is that it's a game of snakes and ladders in terms of maturity and sophistication. Sometimes it's good when you have good people with funded projects and reasonably modern assets and infrastructure, it feels good and everyone feels comfortable. But a few years later, chances are staff turnover, the complexity of the environment, diversity fragmentation, and a climate of budget cuts, staff skills shortages and project failures, and you'll read a report from the Auditor General or from somebody that would lead you to believe that this is little short of a total disaster. And you'll come back again in 3 or 4 years, things are on the up a bit, there's a bit more money, there's some good people, etc. And the problem with this picture, which I believe to be correct, and we can kind of debate it afterwards, of course, if you've got a good IT shop, you'll take offence at this, but many agencies are in exactly this position. And if you go around the jurisdictions in Australia particularly, each of them has audit reports which demonstrate just exactly this. Every year, audit reports show the sort of things that have been recently showed in your review of public-facing systems. Underinvestment, poor quality, etc., etc. And it's not that everyone's not trying hard. This is the thing that annoys me about this picture. As an IT professional, it's not that we haven't had lots of smart people on the case trying to solve this problem, and we ought be seeing that line go continuously and smoothly upwards because we're all great at our jobs and we're doing good work, and it's working in the context of the government. But that's not the case, in my view. New reality number 2, a new world of internet age computing. So cloud services, cloud computing, don't need to labour this too much. Software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, with poster children such as these companies illustrating a new paradigm for how to go about doing IT. And these companies now, in the last 2, 3 years, catching up in terms of waking up to the game, illustrated by Amazon Web Services or Salesforce, and re-engineering themselves to become like these internet age cloud services companies. New reality number 3, a new world of apps. So the whole web services thing is fundamentally changing the way applications are running. Within IT departments, we've been talking about service-oriented architecture for decades with limited result because it's very difficult. It's all about organizational dynamics. And what we're seeing in the internet, so for example, Chrome Web Store, the idea of web services in an app store that can be consumed as services with published APIs, etc. NetBank in Australia, for example, is an app on the Chrome Web Store that you can consume as a service. Even if we look at Amazon's store now, SAP functionality in HANA, the Advanced In-Memory Analytics, is available as an app on the AWS Web Store to be consumed on an hourly basis. This is fundamentally changing the nature of what software is. And when we look at that, John Muzzer of Programmable Web uses this notion of an API billionaires club, which I think is actually quite interesting. And it's the idea that we used to think of these things as websites. You would go to a website to consume a service like it was some kind of online application. And that's no longer the way these things are. What they are is platforms with APIs. So Salesforce now does more transaction volume through its APIs than it does through accessing services from the Salesforce.com website as a software as a service. These applications are now the pure service-oriented architecture thing. They are a black box with published APIs, data coming in and going out, which you can call to do something useful. They create platforms for growth and for ecosystems of functionality. So it's quite a radical change in the logic of applications. New reality number 4, the new world of devices and behaviours. I don't know if any of you follow Mary Meeker. She's kind of famous in internet circles for her portrayal of trends in the internet. And this picture, it's got a variety of different provenances, I think, in terms of where it actually came from originally. But it just summarises for me so accurately what's changed in the way young people use computing. So illustratively, we used to dance. I mean, I embarrass my wife all the time with my dancing at concerts and such like. Now you go to concerts and everyone's just like doing this, recording, holding up devices. What's that about? It shows that there are fundamentally different behaviours and thought processes going on in the way that people use computing now. And of course, when we look at that in a workplace context, we see similar types of things. This idea, does anyone use Yammer? Yammer? So Yammer's, it's kind of like 15%. So Yammer is one of these things which is a good illustration of the power of these lightweight kind of things in the workplace. So a social computing platform which individual people can subscribe to. It's not that kind of technically great if you compare it to something more functionally excellent like Lotus Notes. But nonetheless, it's good enough. It's simple, it's maybe imperfect, but it's moving fast in terms of its evolution. And it now has, I think it's actually 10 million registered subscribers. Of course, it's now owned by Microsoft. But good enough today with regard to these things in the workplace is better than perfect tomorrow. New reality number 5, a new world of data. Has anyone read Web Squared, a paper by John Battelli, who coined the phrase Web 2.0? There's a bit of homework. It's actually worth reading. And John Battelli makes the point that Web 2.0, that phrase has kind of become like old-fashioned now. It's amazing how quickly things move. But it was all about the power of collective intelligence, etc. So crowdsourcing, Wikipedia, etc. Web Squared is all about the idea of the information shadow and the ability to reveal it. Now, one view of this is that what NSA are doing these days is, of course, mining the world's information shadow as represented in the internet. But has anyone used the application where you listen to music and it tells you, hold a magic device up and listen to music and it tells you what it is? Has anyone used that? So if you think about that in system development terms, that's pretty amazing. So the idea is that you just have a magic device. You don't know what you want to know. You just hold the magic device up and it tells you something useful. What's going on there is this idea that there is an information shadow out there in some database somewhere about the music that you're listening to, and a magic new way of finding the data. So it used to be you would need to know what you were looking for, you would need to have a unique search key, and you would need to key it into some database to find it. Now there are ways of finding data that you need or will be useful simply by holding up some magic thing to it. And a good example of that is, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia has this property app guide. Has anyone seen this? Is this in New Zealand, this type of thing? So virtual augmented reality. What you do is you hold a smartphone up to a house, and it's because the smartphone, of course, knows where it is in geospatially, and it knows its orientation from its accelerometer. It actually knows what it's looking at. So what it does, without you doing anything else, is it goes away and gets data on that house, what it last sold for, etc., and brings it onto the screen of the smartphone. So this sort of logic is totally changing the way people think about what an information system is and how you find and access information. Whereas, like, if we think about that in traditional terms, what would you have to do? Go to the house, find its address, key its address into a system that would search a database and bring the information back. Now it just comes by magic onto the screen. New reality number 6, the grass is greener beyond the fence. And this is the bane, of course, of the IT department. So everyone now, users, etc., are straining through the fence, through the corporate firewall, to get access to this greener grass, which is outside the organisation. The fresh green shoots of social media, mobile, cloud services, bring your own devices, etc., etc. So there's a strong sense that corporate IT in this game is losing its monopoly over being the provider of these things. And even so, that sometimes gives rise to disrespectful behaviour from users around corporate IT, which they perceive as kind of slow. and in a bricks and mortar kind of mode. New reality number 7, coming on to where cloud kind of fits into all of this. And I use the phrase cloudy is as cloudy does, if you read any of my rantings around what is cloud services and why is it important. And the logic here is that traditional IT is very much like a used car salesman metaphor in terms of the way business executives tend to perceive it. So trust me, she's going to go like a wee beauty. Give me the money up front, $15 million, and we will produce an application for you which will be ready and perfect in 3.5 years or 2 years or something. Trust me. Whereas cloud services is the opposite proposition. Think of it simply as a service which already exists, has quality certification to varying degrees depending on its maturity, and basically does what it says on the label. And you can verify that before you commit to buying it. And this is kind of the most important thing. Your decision is to become a customer of it, not whether or not it does exist. It's already proven to exist. And the essence of that is this idea of kind of what it is. So simplistically, pooling of standardized resources, secure multi-tenant architecture, automated operations at the infrastructure layer, configurable applications on a service catalog with iterative functional evolution and APIs, at the application layer, and then a provisioning model which has self-provisioning and admin, usage-based charging, transparent quality of service reporting, and is quality certified externally by somebody else. And of course, all working on web services and social networks and on mobile devices. Now, any IT department would say, yeah, that's good, that's what we're doing. We have virtualization, we have cloud services, etc. internally. We're getting on to usage-based charging and billing, and we're getting on to multi-tenant architectures and such like. The difference is that mature cloud service providers have already built all of this, and it turns out to be expensive and difficult. So cloudy is as cloudy does is about the idea that these things already exist. And if we go back to my rather offensive slide of snakes and ladders in government IT, when we look at the mature enterprise-grade cloud service providers, we're not seeing that snakes and ladders picture. Well, you can debate that, and it's true, of course, there are occasional hiccups on the way where things have hiccup for a while, but they get fixed very quickly and then go forward in a sustainable way. And it's all down to the attributes of scale and the ability to invest, and most crucially, the ability to control the service catalog. And if we look at Amazon Web Services, still global, but coming more local. They have an availability region in Sydney now. It's a matter of time, I suppose, from them when they go around their markets, where they invest next. But we look at Amazon Web Services, for example, and the combination of their ability to have secure infrastructure as well as their ability to work with customers to make sure that customers implement their responsibilities means that they're highly secure. I was in Washington earlier in the year, and even though I kind of follow these things reasonably closely, I was shocked. Actually, kind of my jaw dropped when I discovered the degree of penetration of Amazon Web Services into the US federal and state government market in the US. Amazon Web Services is now no different in terms of its trust factor to IBM or HP or any of the traditional IT vendors in the US, because they're fully certified to all of the relevant US government security standards. FISMA moderate makes them, they have the ability to comply with the security requirements of 60 to 70% of the US government market. Only the most secure that they can't do. And as well, they've reduced their prices 31 times since 2006, which is an illustration of cloudy is as cloudy does. This is about scale and about investment in things that work and are proven to work. So, new reality number 8. The other perspective on all of this is to see it through the lens of shared services, to come back to some of my pendulum kind of comments at the start. What are shared services all about? If we look at the dilemmas of government and the snakes and ladders, then we see that what's going on is this idea that we need to get more sharing, less dedicated, customised things, more shared, standardised things, and we need to get scale in order to get economies of scale to reduce the unit cost. And this is driving ICT strategy cyclically over the last few decades. And no matter what your starting point is, you're trying to go up and to the right. In-house shared services, clustering of things within agencies, or chucking it out to a vendor and hoping that they already have that or can do that for you. So what that usually is about is this idea of transforming something that already exists. So you take things that you already own, infrastructure, assets, applications, processes, people, etc., and you crunch them together in some way to transform them into something that is has more scale and has more shared services characteristics. Cloud services, in the other extreme, is buying off a catalogue things that already exist. And this is a kind of fundamental point to be thinking about when we look at the costs and risks and difficulties of trying to move government ICT forward. In Australia and in other jurisdictions, shared services in the public sector have been little short of a total and unmitigated disaster, in my view. And I'm speaking as someone who drove a shared services agenda in Victoria from 2002 to 2005. Now, the reason when I look at this is because of the implementation costs and difficulties of trying to transform things that already exist in the public sector. So the way I look at this is it's about internal socialist economies within government. A closed market, a secret police which rounds up unwilling comrades and herds them into a collective. And with underinvestment, the result is too often that everyone's driving around in a smoky old Trabant, or feels like that, right? And the belief is that with a bit of investment and a bit of focus, it's possible to renovate that smoky old Trabant and turn it into, a souped-up racing car. Now, cloud services and next-generation shared services is about stopping that whole dynamic of thinking, recognising the implementation costs and risks, and saying, look, there is no way to renovate a Trabant into a Nissan Leaf, a modern electric safe vehicle with 8 airbags. It's just not possible. You're not starting from the right raw material. You're better off facing the idea that next generation shared services are cloud services. Cloudy is as Cloudy does. They already exist. You're better off buying it rather than trying to build it yourself. And in particular, better off buying it rather than trying to renovate raw materials that are not appropriate into a cloud service. New reality number 9, agile thinking leverages to innovate. So this is the agile discussion, and we're seeing this big move now from traditional long-term bespoke systems development through a trying to transition point of commercial off-the-shelf software into the standardized multi-tenant software as a service world. From timeframes of years, literally, into timeframes of weeks and months. And this is a fundamental change in the way we think about sourcing ICT capabilities. Now, the essence of that is actually a business executive challenge, not an IT challenge. So Agile is not a systems development methodology, in my view, so much as it is a way of an executive mindset. And the core of it is this idea of changing from internal out requirements into external in requirements logic. So internal out requirements says, how can I procure some form of system to exactly match my understanding of today's needs and functional and technical terms, and change that thinking into how can what's the best way to access IT functionality to support achievement of my evolving business outcomes. These are two quite different ways of thinking. The former, internal out requirements, leads to a 1-year duration project to even define those requirements, which are written up in a big thick book and posted to the market with instructions to build it. And even worse if you're thinking about this as a multi-agency thing, because as well as slavishly documenting all those requirements, you've got to get agreement of all the multiple parties as to what this thing should do. And the requirements document becomes even thicker as a consequence, full of unrealistic notions which are not informed by any practical thinking of the cost-benefit trade-offs of what it is you're trying to do. Because the people defining those requirements aren't aware of the costs and don't have any accountability for it. External in requirements is all about this idea of starting off with a clear focus on your business outcomes and then going out to the market and having a look to see what's available to move you forward towards your business outcomes. And then going through a cycle of trade-offs and thinking about, okay, well, how could we do this? What's the sweet spot? Some of those requirements we had, we thought they're a bit unrealistic now, we look at it. So maybe we should be a bit more practical. And this is what's driving a lot of the move from bespoke, dedicated, on-premise software and applications towards configured shared cloud services, which occupy a sweet spot, really, of what it is you thought you wanted, what can be done at a certain time frame and cost, and therefore the best way of moving ahead. But the reason I say this is an executive problem is that it's executives that frame this whole proposition of how we should go to market. So it's important to be engaging in this discussion with business executives, not just IT people. New reality number 10, there are 10, it takes 2 to tango. So I use this phrase now, agile thinking plus cloud services equals innovation and productivity. It takes 2 to tango. So this agile thinking bit is actually the most important part of thinking about cloud services. Assuming that cloud services exist as trusted platforms, then it's the combination of the two. And what we're seeing with cloud services is the ability to create more agile thinking in environments when otherwise it would not have occurred. Government is pretty much stuck with its procurement processes when you go through a traditional IT project. You're stuck with internal out requirement specification, long-term waterfall development projects, etc. There's a kind of inevitable character to it. Whereas the use of cloud services actually becomes a stimulus for thinking through things in a more agile way. And the result is innovation and productivity. So, story so far. Status quo is unsustainable. New world of computing, apps, devices, and data. Greener grass beyond the fence. Cloudy is as cloudy does. Next generation shared services. Agile thinking. Takes 2 to tango. Now, really? So you say, well, that's all very good, Steve, that you're just full of nonsense. Is this really happening? And it is. So, anecdotally, there are many examples now, public sector and broadly public sector organisations, around where cloud services are being used in Australia and New Zealand and around other jurisdictions. This is a kind of tip of the iceberg kind of a list. The CBA, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, not public sector, but just to illustrate, hosts cba.com.au, its main website, on Amazon Web Services. Even I was kind of shocked, actually, when I heard that. In New Zealand, you know, there's a fair amount of traction now building for Rivera and IBM and Datacom in terms of their infrastructure as a service operations. Statistics New Zealand hosted the census, some of the census applications and data processing on Rivera's infrastructure as a service. Now, people actually in Australia, they would be shocked. Actually, I didn't know that until yesterday. Australia would not host its statistics, a census process on a cloud service yet, mainly because the agency responsible for that has enough money not to need to. But this is radical. This is kind of radical stuff in terms of proof points, and it turned out to be a good experience for Statistics New Zealand. And one of the most interesting projects around the world at the moment in public sector IT is New South Wales Department of Trade and Investment, where they are implementing SAP Business by Design software as a service as a externally hosted in Waldorf, data replicated in Sydney, software as a service application for core ERP, finance, HR, procurement, as the kernel of a new shared services strategy for 9 and then 15 agencies in that portfolio agency. So that they are living exactly what I was talking about in terms of more agile, pragmatic compromise of requirements to what the software does, shared services based on cloud services. And that project has been running now for just about a year and is going very well. So as well as those kind of anecdotal examples, I've been writing up case studies for the last year or so on fairly detailed examinations of what it feels like for an agency to go down, or a public sector organisation to go down the software as a service path. So there's a detailed case study of Monash University's adoption of Google Apps for all students and all staff, a huge strategic commitment to Google Apps, Salvation Army Employment Plus's infrastructure as a service in Telstra, an agency in Queensland and their Microsoft Dynamics CRM experiences, business and innovation in Victoria, use of Salesforce for interactions management and for grants administration. And this is a very detailed and clear illustration of exactly what I've been talking about up until now. Torres Strait Island Council is a local government council, use of infrastructure as a service. And I have another couple of case studies pending on human services use of Oracle CRM for disability, for carer management, so a carer's register and quality of care system for in-home care, and disability services in South Australia. So these are real and detailed kind of qualitative examinations of how this feels in practice for agencies. And the experiences are that the solutions are better, the implementation is faster, orders of magnitude faster, the costs are orders of magnitude less. The risks are, when all things are considered, much, much reduced because of the faster timeframes in the main. And it's all about driving innovation. When you look at this, it's not about cutting costs, it's about driving innovation. And these case studies reveal more about leadership and decision making than they do about the abstract benefits of cloud services. When you look at these case studies, they are not IT projects. In the main, they were led by business executives, and in the main, out of frustration with the inadequacy of the status quo for doing IT. These are stories of leadership and decision making. Now, this leads me to the framework that Mark introduced, which I call the Ovum Cloud Services Catalyst Framework. And this was me trying to puzzle over how was it that some of these agencies managed to become early adopters of cloud services when others were at that time, this was several years ago, just standing there going, you know, well, no, we don't need cloud services, and anyway it's not safe, and anyway, you know, why would you bother? It's just about consumer grade things, it's not relevant to government. And at that time I used to use the three metaphors of Toad of Toad Hall, Chicken Little, and Eeyore to describe the way people would think about it. You know, you met people at the time who were Toad of Toad Hall, and I would be categorised as a Toad of Toad Hall. You know, wow, this is the shiny new thing. This is fantastic. We should all get on board. Most people in IT departments, at best, were Eeyore. You know, oh, give me a break. Ah, we've seen this before, it didn't work last time, it won't work this time. And even more, many of them were Chicken Little, you know. The sky is falling, this is a disaster, the data's going to be insecure, what about data sovereignty, what about privacy? And this conversation would go round and around and around. So how was it that these organisations managed to get their head around this? So, there are 8 catalysts. Some of them are about leadership, some of them are about business needs, and some of them are about what I call internet age thinking. So the first one is, and these could be high or low in a given agency. So acknowledge mismatch between business needs and ICT means. Did the executive think that IT was a problem and feel frustrated with the inadequacy of their ability to do stuff with IT? Yes or no? Was there some kind of imperative or willingness to act decisively, either because of an external circumstance or because of an internal, the executive accepting responsibility for the fact that he or she needed to act? Was there an opportunity, or could an opportunity be created for some kind of greenfield start? So was there a way of saying, bugger it, there is just too much complexity here, let's just get started and carve out some space to do this? Was this in its application some kind of environment where it was uncertain, where demand was volatile, or it needed to be able to scale up or down quickly? And was there a willingness to use a service with no or minimal customization, either because of a decision to do so, or because that aligned well with the functional needs? Now, if those catalysts were high or high-ish, then it's actually possible to get your head around infrastructure as a service as a way of doing it. What about the idea of ubiquitous access? So if this was the kind of application that needed to be accessed outside from any device, in any place, outside of the corporate firewall, then that's useful. And what about a preparedness to access iteratively evolving functionality to drive innovation? That's also useful. What about executives that are thinking, back to my comments about internal out versus external in requirements, that are thinking in terms of my world is changing constantly, so the most important thing is to tune into solutions which are also changing constantly, rather than traditional thinking of saying, no, we need to have the requirements locked down in concrete and not changing for years at a time. So if you can get your head around those, you can kind of get your head around software as a service. And then the final catalyst is this enthusiasm to embrace an agile and flexible platform or ecosystem of solutions, which is the idea of service-oriented architecture, web services, and ecosystems that form around that. And if you can get your head around that, then platform as a service actually starts to make a bit more sense. So these are the cloud services catalysts, and they are useful in a discussion with business executives to try and frame ways of thinking about the next application or the next ICT thing that you're thinking of. And just to be provocative then, how would it feel if the catalysts were all low? Then it would feel like you have executives that are complacent or satisfied with their IT environment, either because it's great or they don't know how bad it is. They're not prepared to act, or there are no imperatives to act. Everything's too complicated and integrated. It's not possible to find a place to get started. It just needs to be, the application just needs to be accessed inside the firewall, inside the office, so you don't need all that. We want something that's locked down. We don't like this ecosystem stuff. We want long-term strategic commitments with one vendor. This willingness to use everything needs to be customized to us specifically. And our demand is fixed and certain, so we don't need that. This is how it would feel. And that, unfortunately, tends to be the characteristic of the way many people think about government IT, which is why some of the resistance is there. So this framework provides a way of thinking about leadership decisions, internet age thinking, etc. But, of course, there are a whole lot of complexities and difficulties. So the root of it is that this is all around pragmatic trade-offs. That it's not about saying there is one best way to do something. It's about trade-offs, and trade-offs are often between two ways of doing something where you can't necessarily say one is absolutely bad. There are two ways of doing something. It's just about working out which is better in the circumstances. And it's about trading off customization versus standardization, dedication versus sharing, etc., 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 without going through all those. These slides will be available after, so you can... So when we see the successful adopters, they've been able to internalize a discussion about trade-offs, as opposed to black and white thinking. It's also, of course, not about one size fits all. Not all applications or workloads are appropriate, so it's a question of thinking through those that are. And I can't remember the number of times, for example, in a session like this around the world, I'll rabbit on in the way that I do, and somebody will say, that's all nonsense. We can't put the tax system into Amazon. And you go, okay, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there are a set of applications where these platforms or these applications, software as a service, or these workload hosting environments are appropriate. And it's a matter of looking at the drivers for that. And then we need to start thinking about the catalysts. And if the catalysts, for example, were low in your executive audience and you wanted to try and move in this direction, then what are the insertion points or the influence points that you could use? And my logic on this is, at the leadership level, the most powerful thing are case studies, thought leadership, and peer interactions. So stories about how it felt for other agencies, thought leadership, so just getting out there and talking about this stuff and socialising the ideas with your executives, and then peer interactions, putting your executives into touch with other executives and other agencies that have already done it, and doing designed matchmaking to make that happen. So these strategies can be quite effective at changing the way executives think. Business needs analysis just needs to focus on surfacing the business needs that are appropriate. And then internet age thinking really only comes from hands-on experience. So in your IT department, you have to have experience of using cloud services, in my view, because then you will see the benefits. So when we look at the early adopters, we see that they were experimenting and mucking around with cloud services years ago, even some 3 or 4 years ago with Salesforce, for example. And that's what gave them the early confidence and understanding to do some of the bigger projects that they've done. It's all about organisational learning and about the propagation of ideas and experiences. It's the most important thing. We need new thinking about risk management. We can talk about this perhaps in questions, but contract and service level agreement is no longer the way to think about this. Of course we need those. I'm not saying we don't. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. Because in this world, we're dealing in a different place. The wrath of the crowd actually becomes a much bigger discipline on these vendors than any individual agency could possibly do when we're talking about large-scale, broadly adopted cloud services. A prenuptial agreement on data is fundamental, the most important thing. I love you dearly, darling, but who's going to keep the cat? Tested plan B, so it's axiomatic with cloud services because you don't own it and it's not in your environment that it may one day fail. What are you going to do then? So a tested plan B is a core part of it. Department of Business and Innovation and their use of Salesforce in Melbourne get their data back every night and have tested this kind of skeleton application that enables them to interrogate the data and limp along as a business continuity measure. And then the clearest thing about risk management and all of this is this whole business about same old traditional kind of IT information management, data categorization and governance. And one of the things we see when we look at early adopter experiences is that actually this is the most important part of the discussion. And it's the part of the discussion that IT professionals have always been responsible for, but have usually been negligent on because they've spent so much of their time and effort mucking around with infrastructure and fighting fires on security and application updates and patching to software and et cetera, et cetera. So data categorization, information management and governance is the most critical risk management tool, and it's actually what you have more time to do when you're using cloud services, because your resources and capacities can be deployed on that rather than doing commoditized, rather non-value adding activities. So then of course it's all about hybrid things. So we're not talking about throwing everything into cloud services, and we're certainly not talking about users running amok in rogue cloud services procurement. What we're thinking about is, given that we have in-house IT capabilities, which perhaps we acknowledge to be caught in a snakes and ladders game, how can cloud services help the IT organisation out with meeting the demands of business units and agencies? And now partially that's about cloud services being passed through, so the IT department becomes a broker or a procurer or an orchestrator of cloud services for users. Partially it's about cloud services being consumed by the IT department to run their applications or their workloads. Maybe the notion of private clouds internal to the IT department, although to be honest I'm very suspicious about that whole discussion because of my Trabant and leaf kind of metaphor. These turn out to be expensive and difficult to build. And then of course policies and guidelines, because some cloud services may be consumed directly by users without the IT department being involved, and we need to have a way of influencing that. To go back to that discussion on transformation versus buying on a catalogue, the logic of what's going on here is actually more important or as important compared to the discussion of should you go out and buy a cloud service. So I really encourage people to think of this in two ways. One, cloud services might be something that you want to buy and use. That's great. If there are cloud services available that meet your need, go for it. But the most important thing actually is to really puzzle over the logic of what's going on here and what it's causing in terms of the changes of the way we do IT. And to go right back to the start then, my whole theoretical basis for thinking about this is the damn pendulum swinging backwards and forwards. And I suppose I've come to the realization that this may be the only way that government can secure for itself a sustainable way to avoid this pendulum, because of the fact that cloud services are external to government. Now, they're not just traditional fixed dedicated outsourcing type things. What they are is evolving, adaptive, configurable resources which have a commitment to sustainability which goes way beyond government. So assuming we're not just talking about a cloud service that only services government agencies, if we're talking about a cloud service that services many different organisations, perhaps hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands around the world, then that service has a continuity and a sustainability which is way beyond anything government could ever consider doing. And to separate that from government and to make it a service which is consumed strengthens both. The service is strengthened by government's demand and funding, and government is strengthened by then being able to rely on a service which is not so stuck in its snakes and ladders picture. So in summary, before we just have time for questions, so start thinking about questions. Then to summarise what I'm talking about, then just to quickly, this was what it was about. Proliferation, this clicker is not that great. New realities, greener grass, cloudy is as cloudy does. Agile thinking plus cloud services equals innovation, productivity. Really, yes, there are examples of it. With catalysts, you can think about it in a structured way. But there are some things to be thought about, of course. And so, Vicky Pollard, do you know Vicky Pollard? So Matt Lucas's alter ego, of course. So we have time for just questions and discussion now. We actually have only 20 minutes. I apologise, I've gone over a bit. So what do you think of that? Is that all rubbish? These blow-ins from overseas? the way I do this when I have question time is we can just sit here in silence for 20 minutes if you like.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Freer from Inland Revenue. That was very interesting. Thank you very much for that. I do have a question, though, on the catalysts for change. Now, most of the catalysts, 7 out of 8, look to me like enablers. One of them looks like a disabler, and that's the one that says willingness to use a service with no customization, which has been the cause of failure of many IT projects for pretty much ever. And I wonder if you had any insights as to the critical factors to change that particular
Customization thing. That's the most important thing is hands-on experience. So that is one of the internet age thinking catalysts. And as I said, the most impactful way to drive internet age thinking is to do it. And because seeing is doing, it's a reality. That's the only way to unwind a whole lot of baked in, deeply ingrained emotional experience in the IT organization. And when you, if I think about, for example, Monash University's adoption of Google Apps, just to give you a quick example. So Monash University had tried for almost a decade to drive consolidation, standardization, rationalization across the university, which is a very large organization globally. And analogous to government agencies in this. Lotus Notes, they were trying to drive Lotus Notes adoption across as the common platform. And it was just nothing short of a disaster. And they were doing it in the traditional manner, customise, standardise, etc. The CIO retired, the business executive grabbed the project and drove a cloud services model, Microsoft versus Google. They chose Google, it was in 2009. And they experienced for the first time the idea that systems get better without them having to do anything because of the iterative evolution coming into the software. And the most impactful part of that revelation was in all of their requirements thinking for how this would move forward, they had not really put much thought into mobile platforms. This was 2008-9. At that stage, they had a few thousand students using the My Monash portal on mobile devices. Within a few years, they had 75,000 students using mobile devices. And they hadn't designed for it at all. But there's a click box on Google Apps that says optimize for mobile. So it worked. The system, because of its iterative evolution and because the system itself is living in the internet age and moving forward with hundreds of thousands of users all around the world, then they learned that you don't need to over-specify these things. They don't need to be customized. For some categories of applications, it's better just to source a capability which is moving forward. It's about direction of travel. Now, in tax, of course, we're not talking the core tax systems, but some applications, and it's only by seeing it and experiencing it, really. So find small ways to get started to expose the experience of that.
Hi, Steve. I have a question over here, Matt.
Sorry, hi.
So I guess the question for me is, what do you see that the in-house IT team needs to do, or how do they need to change in order to react or to get ahead of this change and proactively?
And in part, I think it's, if I can just go back to there, I think it's just about acknowledging the fact that it will be a hybrid environment. So, and the IT department must be part of it. Like I'm actually not in any way in favour of rogue cloud services adoption by business units without going through professional processes, privacy impact assessments, information categorisation and governance, security considerations, etc. Because if you look at many jurisdictions, that behaviour is what's caused suspicion and fear around cloud services. So APRA in Australia, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, issued advice in March last year to financial services institutions in Australia to say that they were very worried about cloud services adoption in the financial services sector. And what they were worried about was rogue cloud services adoption. So cloud services adoption without going through the usual professional thought process. And so rogue adoption is very dangerous to the whole movement because it will lead to bad things, as you'd expect from kind of unprofessional adoption of anything. So the IT department's got to be front and centre in this by having policies and guidelines around the use, and by using it themselves, getting hands-on experience, and by orchestrating and integrating cloud services and providing them to users. Sorry, yep.
Good morning, Stephen Clark, also from Inland Revenue. You mentioned that one of the core and emerging issues is information management, but it was often neglected due to perceived greater requirement of focus on other areas such as infrastructure. What do you think will drive organisations and executives to refocus on the needs and requirements to have a really, really strong information management that's the centre of system design, particularly in cloud?
Well, it's a good question, because it's actually the core of a lot of the issue in public sector particularly, and it's all about doing it, which simplistically is about having the resources and focus and bandwidth, executive bandwidth to focus on that. One of the things I find interesting looking at case studies is the perceived danger of cloud services actually makes them safer. So the perception that this is external and that it needs to be thought about properly because it feels dangerous actually means that, that the organisations focus a lot on making sure that it's done properly. Privacy impact assessments, risk assessments, security reviews, etc. The net of all that is usually that the solution is more secure than any other solution that they have. And actually, because of the fact that you have externalised all of that effort in running the application and the infrastructure, you've freed up capacity internally, and you can actually focus on information management activities. There's a sense that you must do so because it feels dangerous, and you have the resources to do it, which both of those things were not necessarily there before, because it felt safe because it's all in-house and fluffy-duffy, and you didn't have the resources to do it anyway because everyone was busy running the status quo. That's the way I see it.
Hi, Steve Catlow, Ministry of Education. A lot of the premise that you've made on the cloud services are great, is a different engagement model that business and IT have got at the moment.
Yep.
So, particularly that slide, I have a problem with that. The arrows need to be the other way around, surely. That the business units would be engaging with the IT department to make best use of the cloud services rather than the services coming in the other way. And on that premise, that if most of the elements you've described as making best use of cloud services, business driving the change, willing to accept standardisation, which as a comment was made before, the business generally isn't, and they say, no, I want it my way.
Yep.
What impact does cloud services make over, any other outsourced agreement or a good in-house solution when you turn that the other way around?
Yeah. Look, I think it's just all about changing behaviours. I agree it's difficult and complicated. So one of the best phrases to describe that is, has anyone heard of an I want a pony project? So this idea that business people have the desire for something which is not necessarily informed by practical thinking or whatever. And a lot of IT gets driven by I want a pony projects from executives. Somehow or other, this is not a one-shot change, because we're talking about changing the way people think and behave, etc. You need to expose your business executive clients to new ways of going about the process of having a discussion about what it is they want, how that need could be satisfied, and how services could be provided at much lower cost and faster implementation. The net of that is a change in this. So I agree you could fiddle with the diagram, turn the arrows around and make them circles, and but I don't know. Does that make sense? Not really.
I just think it sounds too easy.
Yeah.
The major cost of change is going to be the business side.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
When you do that, then I don't, the value of cloud services as you described them
maybe aren't as great as they are. And secondly to that, cloud services is a very new market, and it is market driven.
Yes.
So where does it leave a company when your cloud service gets switched off?
Yep.
Because it's been bought out, or
Yeah.
they haven't paid the bills?
Yes. Now this is a very good point. So in the UK, just to address that one, so the question is around the notion of reliance on cloud services that may disappear. And this is, of course, a bigger and bigger problem the further you are down the root and branches of the world's IT organisations. So when you get down to Wellington, the market's a bit thin. When the New Zealand government went out to procure infrastructure as a service for that panel a few years ago, I think they pretty much discovered that it didn't exist, and that it needed to be nurtured in terms of the relationships that now exist with IBM and Rivera and Datacom. There's a few ways to look at that. Direction of travel is an important way to think. So where's all this going? And if anything I've said resonates with you, then the direction of travel to me is very clear, which is important to go back to the notion of cloud logic. The world is changing here, and the future will be more like the way I've articulated it, in my view. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's literally here today for any application or anything that you might wish to buy. And I know that there's a procurement going on for content management systems, I think, at the moment, where that market's probably a little bit thin in New Zealand when you look at it literally today. But you have to look at it in terms of where this is trending to and what the direction of travel is. There's a particular danger, in my view, for government departments becoming reliant on small and immature cloud services providers. I absolutely agree with you. So the UK government, for example, has gone down this track of creating a cloud store for the UK government, where a substantial part of the driver of that strategy is industry development policy. So putting 20% of government's demand into the small to medium business sector in the UK. And they're discovering that in the context of cloud services, it's kind of interesting because they've got like 1,000 or more cloud service providers on their app store, which even when the Cabinet Office goes to buy them, they kind of discover that it's two guys above a shop running some business that's only, not even necessarily operational. So there's a clear sense that the exemplars, the Salesforces and the Amazons, etc. of the world, Datacom here in New Zealand, are getting to the point where you can rely on them because they have scale and breadth and depth. But that doesn't mean that any small company that says that it has a software as a service or infrastructure as a service operation should be trusted. It's no different to any other way of sourcing IT. There are counterparty risks. And in particular, this whole notion of having a tested plan B is fundamental. There are complexities and costs and issues in there. It's the same as any other way of doing IT. But if you think of it in direction of travel terms, then even if you're kind of suspicious, my advice is to get some cloud services procurement activity going so that even if you're suspicious, in a year's time you'll have hands-on experience and can make more informed judgments. Sorry, down the front here.
Hi, Uma Mukherjee, Inland Revenue again. Steve, you had a list of successful adoption of cloud services examples.
Mm-hmm.
My question is that I'm sure there are some unsuccessful attempts. And do you have any insights on what are the things that make cloud services adoption unsuccessful?
Yes. Now, in terms of detailed case studies, no, because the ones I've looked at, are successful. And why would that be anything otherwise? Because people don't ask me to write case studies on things that were a disaster. Actually, I had a question at a conference in London a month ago where somebody asked me why there aren't more case studies describing lessons learned from disasters. And my response was to say to the person, good, okay, well, let's arrange a meeting on Monday morning and I'll come to your office and you can tell me all of the disastrous things you've done and I'll write case studies on them. It doesn't happen that way. But when you look at this sort of, broad anecdotal story, then the bad news stories tend not to surface, is one, so you don't know about them. But secondly, the ones that I know about, which I would put in the category of rogue cloud services adoption. So business units or business executives that went out and got a software as a service application and started using it with no consideration of what information should be in there, how to protect themselves, how to negotiate the contract, what risk management provisions, what privacy impact assessment, what security reviews. And then the IT department found out about it and it was switched off. And a lot of this has been driven in the financial services sector by APRA's concerns. And just to make that point, what APRA said, the Australian Prudential and Regulation Authority, was that their advice was to directors, that directors of organisations should pay attention and ask questions. And when directors did, there were some cloud services that did turn out to be unsafe and unjustifiable. Not because the service was unsafe. Many of these were, for example, Salesforce, but because it had been procured in a way that wasn't professionally managed. And that would be the case with any software. That's kind of my experience. I don't know. Does anyone have experience of bad news stories with cloud services? Yep. Mega upload. Ah, yes. Well, look, there are a few examples of cloud services over the years which have evaporated, which is back to prenuptial agreement on the data. So if it's mission critical for you to have access to your data 24/7, or to be able to get it back, then keep a copy. Like, that's just basic IT logic, right? Sorry, up the back.
Thank you. Dan Rando, I'm an independent consultant. You've talked about the efficiencies and cost savings that can be gained by shifting from managing infrastructure and applications to using cloud services, and the opportunity to spend the savings on better governance and security and risk management and data categorization. Is there a risk that the cost savings will simply result in budget cuts and the IT department carries on with snakes and ladders management?
Absolutely. And there's a long track record of exactly that disaster. So that's something to be thought through. So there are a couple of perspectives on that. One of the reasons for the snakes and ladders is that climate of budget cutting that goes on in government agencies and the inherent unsustainability of the model. Now, there's an interesting paradox with software as a service in particular. So if you have a software as a service application, let's say hypothetically, we'll use Salesforce, which you use as for an application which the business needs, is mission critical and is working well. How easy is it to cut the budget on Salesforce? The problem that's led to the snakes and ladders issue is the fact that IT has been an easy target for budget cuts, because you can go to the IT budget and say, there's got to be 20% of fat in there, I'd like you to cut it out. But you have to keep delivering the same applications and the same services on the same infrastructure. I'm not going to allow you to cut any services. So what software as a service does is it totally exposes the TCO of these applications. So with a business executive, an IT department can have a conversation which is, okay, if you'd like me to cut 20%, I'll need to cut this service because it's externally hosted and there is a cost to it. We can cut the number of users on it maybe, or we can just cut it all together. It's your choice as a business executive, you make the call. But what you're doing is protecting the sustainability of your ability to deliver that service, rather than pretending that you can keep delivering sustainable services whilst continually cutting the budget to do it. So that's one aspect to it. The idea of protecting people to focus on information management is really just kind of a management issue. I agree it's a problem, but it's something that just needs to be managed. At least you have the opportunity to do that. That's the issue. Yep.
Hi, I sort of see the cloud as being analogous to the housing market, where it's always cheaper to rent than to buy, and you don't have to fix it when it breaks. But do you see the pendulum ever swinging back where people will prefer ownership to renting?
Only if you believe that you can, with a magic wand, solve all the problems of managing in-house IT in a budget-constrained environment. So, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Like, you know, is cloud services really just another version of the pendulum, you know, which will... And I suppose at this point, maybe I'm just kind of romantic, but I don't think so, because what we're talking about is sustainable services which deliver for large numbers of a diverse customer base. And that gives them a kind of sustainability, and the fact that they're continually improving. And if they're not continually improving, then they die. So there's a kind of sustainability there, which works for me at this point. Now maybe that's just naive in the sense that the reason I've come to this view is because I can't see a solution to the problems of managing in-house IT in a sustainable way. In-house IT is fantastic if you've got the money to do it well. But I don't see that being true for government agencies looking forward, you know. In all jurisdictions, there's a small number of agencies that can say they have the money to do IT well. The tax agency, the statistics agency, critical human services agencies. But there are also another 80% of the number of agencies that are small, subscale, delivering diverse services, and are just not funded in a sustainable way. And that's the sweet spot in my view for this model. I just can't see another way ahead that is sustainable at this point. I'll come back next year.
Thank you, Steve. That was wonderful. Thank you, Steve. Just a quick note this morning, thank you to our sponsor once again, Webb Henderson, and they're also sponsor of the morning tea, which I won't stand in your way of. See you back here at 11 o'clock. Thank you.